Hello and welcome to today's meeting. Former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard identified the absurd nature of the present danger of the strategic miscalculation of the United States that could lead to thermonuclear war with Russia. She has asked the question, quote, are we prepared to see our loved ones burn alive in a nuclear holocaust in a war with Russia over Ukraine? If not, cut out the macho saber rattling and de escalate before it's too late. Sometimes the subjective factor, the lack of insight into the mind of another person, language, or culture, is actually the central problem. Helga Zepp LaRouche, chairwoman of the Schiller Institute, responding to the call by Syrian Catholic Cardinal Zinari for a lifting of sanctions against Syria, has asserted that the moral indifference that greets the present impending descent of the planet into chaos, in which disease, famine, and war dominate, requires a new paradigm of engagement. She has called for the establishment of a committee for the coincidence of opposites, which would seek to reveal to ostensibly opposed nations, cultures, factions, and parties the higher self-interests that all have. For example, the self-interest of the human species is not contradictory to the self-interest of the nation state. An alliance of the nations of Russia and China with a United States that used its sovereign powers of credit generation, for example, to launch a crash program for worldwide physical production in mining, in manufacturing, and in agriculture. The investment of trillions into a nuclear and thermonuclear power plant based industrial and manufacturing platform, this would be completely different than the present military impetus that we see in the design that's proposed by NATO. We have a situation in which there's about $2 quadrillion that is associated with the international debt system, the so-called international money system powered by the United States dollar. But that's not really a United States dollar. It's a zombie dollar system, which does not represent the American people, but has been hung on the back of the American people. And America and every other nation will be destroyed by that debt, or that system must be destroyed. That debt is unpayable. This is not a system of capital formation or wealth generation. It's a system of financial Malthusianism. And war, including sanctions, are an expression of that financial looting policy against the interests of all other nations, including the United States itself. Today, we entitled the presentation, The Choice, Self-Destruction is Not Inevitable. Self-destruction, as posed, for example, in Hamlet's famous to be or not to be soliloquy, is a choice. 25 years ago, in a meeting of the Schiller Institute's Human Rights Commission, Lyndon LaRouche addressed how Americans have to be shaken out of their self-destructive slumber by the leadership that they themselves provide. We're going to now view a portion of that discussion that happened back in 1995 between Lyndon LaRouche and commissioners of that panel, and in this case, particularly a dialogue between Lynn and the civil rights lawyer J.L. Chestnut, who was an associate of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King from Selma, Alabama.
There's no need for somebody begging out in the street to get somebody else's job. There's a lot of work to be done. You just look at the Tom Bigby project and what should have been done to complete that. That'll keep people busy for a long time. You take the American water system. Our aquifers are turning into sewers when they're not going dry because we're not building a water project, which we need. We don't have enough power. We have 20%. When we came out of World War II, there were 60% of us in the labor force were producing material goods. Today, less than 20%. We have coupon clippers, we have unemployed, we have people in prison, but 20% are producing. Our standard of living in the United States today, in physical terms, if you include healthcare, education, science and technology, plus the things you physically consume, we're half of what we were 25 years ago. We're about that in productivity. This nation is going down the sewer. The world's going down the sewer. We have the means, and government has the means, to turn it around. When enough people in this country stand up on their hind legs and stop voting for what they don't want, or for a result they don't want. And I think that if the problem with people, as I see it, is people don't trust the leadership, and I don't blame them for not trusting their leadership. I blame them for being too pessimistic. And it's up to us and others to get enough people moving to create a movement. Like the case just of Martin Luther King. Now, I never personally met Martin Luther King, but I watched him closely. And I know something about Martin Luther King from people who knew him and his circumstances. And here's a man who's a good man. He's a preacher, Baptist preacher. I don't know how they run to this way and that way. But one day somebody appointed him, nominated him to be a leader of the civil rights movement, out of a crowd, so to speak. He took the job as an appointee, like a federal appointee, only this was a civil rights movement. He went from crisis to crisis in a few years from the time that he received that appointment until he went to his death, knowing he was facing death. And in that period of time, he made a number of public speeches of great power and pith. Each of those speeches corresponded to a point of crisis in the history of the civil rights movement. And I saw on television, and I read in the recorded speeches, I read a man who had gone into private, into his own Gethsemane, probably inspired by reading the New Testament, and said, I will drink of this cup. And he came out with an idea, with a lot of people swarming around him. But he came out with the idea, and he presented a concept which took a whole people who were looking to him in the civil rights movement, and he ennobled them. He said, you're not fighting for African-American rights, you're fighting for everybody's rights. You're fighting to make the Constitution real. And it was a new idea, a different idea. And as he did with his mountain speech that he gave just before he went, again, a man who had walked into Gethsemane and said, yes, Lord, I will drink of this cup as my Savior before me. And he went out and he drank of the cup, and he inspired people. Now, we don't know who among us is going to be the great leader of this period. But we know, as the civil rights people of the 1960s who had been in the civil rights business for many centuries, in point of fact, many of them with a conscious family tradition, they assembled together. They picked people from their midst as leaders. And among these leaders was Martin Luther King. And I think if enough of us assemble today around these kinds of issues and show the nation that there is something moving, something which is of concern to the average citizen, that from among those we gather, together for that purpose, we will find the leaders we need.
Mrs. Robertson, as you know, and I did know Martin Luther King. And about a month before Mrs. Robertson then went across that bridge in Selma and changed the world, a delegation of about 7 people, including King, went to visit the president, Mr. Johnson, to ask him to present to the Congress a voting rights bill. And Mr. Johnson said, boys, I just gave you a civil rights bill last year. You can go to the Holiday Inn. Now you can go anywhere I want to go. The country won't stand for 2 civil rights bills in a row. Said, go back home, be quiet. Quiet down. Of course, they didn't. And Mrs. Robertson then went back and went across that bridge. And there was Lyndon Johnson watching all that on the television. And a few days later, there he was before joint session of Congress, presenting what became the 1965 Civil Rights Statute. And he ended if you remember. He ended that speech with, "We shall overcome." Martin King later told me that he and his wife were watching that on television. And when Lyndon Johnson said that, a little tear rolled down his cheek. And I said to him, well, the little tear rolled down mine, but for different reasons. It may well be that you are no longer the #1 civil rights leader in America. Lyndon is. The same man who 30 days ago said, "Go back home and be quiet." I just think that racism in America is so much a part of the fabric, so much a part of the history, that it clouds everything. And I don't know how we can honestly even address the very serious concerns that you have and the rest of us have, unless we first try to find some way to grapple directly with this filth that's in the hearts of so many Americans. I'll say this, and I'll hush, and I just want to hear your comment about it.
I think what you say is true. I think that nothing can cure that problem except redemption. This is not one of the things that can ebb away easily. It's there. Because people in America still today do not believe that when they look behind the eyes of a human being, there's something there which is divine, a potential for creative reason. And that is the distinction between man and animal. That people in the United States today tend to be persuaded that their lusts, their appetites, their greed, their pleasure, their personal pain are everything. And everything is physical. And therefore they say, well, if you've got a physical difference, that makes your personality. Because they don't see, when they don't believe in education, when they don't see a baby and say that baby is going to have a classical humanist education to bring out the human divine potential in that little mind, when they say, well, that baby belongs to this race and therefore he shouldn't have that education because he's not going to have that kind of job. He should have a second-grade education or third-grade education. That when you have a nation that does not see behind the eyes of another human being an essentially beautiful principle which is divine, which partakes of the nature of God, the power of creative reason, you're going to have racism. And therefore, only a nation which gets down on its knees, in a sense, and says, we were about to be destroyed. You think Job had troubles? We've got some real stuff here. And when a nation senses that, how close they are to destruction, and demand redemption, I think that's the only thing that's going to cure them. I don't think anything else will cure them. We can cure it with education over generations, but to cure it now with this nation is an act of redemption.
Pessimism that LaRouche attacked in the American people then is the pessimism that we have to attack now in order to save or to redeem the United States. We have to think about the world first, the human species first, and then the United States' role toward the human species, but only in the context of the human species first. Now, to report to you the tragedy of the immediate moment and the hope of the immediate moment, both of which are contained in the present circumstance, we've assembled a panel today. We have Harley Schlanger, who has been doing the daily updates that people have been getting, both from the LaRouche organization, and he's also just well known on his own as a blogger. We have Hussein Askary, who's a Southwest Asia coordinator for the Schiller Institute and the co-author of the Executive Intelligence Review report on the Silk Road and extending the Silk Road into Southwest Asia and Africa, and Diane, who is an independent candidate for the United States Senate in New York State, running against Chuck Schumer. So we're going to begin first with Harley Schlanger. Harley?
Thanks, Dennis. I'm going to take up what Lynn was talking about at the end of my presentation and how we can look at the situation to overcome what otherwise is a tragedy that's unfolding. But I wanted to take a hard look at the strategic crisis because we're facing a series of potential wars that are resulting from policies that are being pushed. At the same time, the financial system is cratering, it's collapsing. And it's not a coincidence. The people who have brought the world to a financial disintegration are hoping they can pull a switcheroo into a great reset and a Green New Deal to pump up a new bubble, but at the same time to destroy the living standards of the population as a way of collecting loot. And so to think that these people actually care about the conditions of citizens of either the United States or any other country is a great miscalculation. But the question we have to take up is, why is there not a great public outcry against this? So I'm going to take a look at three hotspots. I'll go through these fairly quickly, but there's a great deal of material on the LaRouche Organization site and in the Executive Intelligence Review that gives you more detail. But I want to paint a picture of what the danger is and then how we can overcome it. I'm going to talk about three hotspots primarily. One is Southwest Asia. And of course, we'll hear from Hussein after me on how to resolve the problems there with a reconstruction program. But at present, we're dealing with all kinds of irregular warfare, disintegration, unclear outlook of strategy. When you talk about Syria, you talk about Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Israel. It's a highly volatile region that's largely volatile because of the influence of British geopolitics. And I'll go through a little bit on the Syria situation tonight. Secondly, Ukraine, where there's still a very immediate war danger between Ukraine and Russia, which would immediately involve bringing in NATO and the United States. Now, some people say we've passed the peak of this. I think it's important to realize that the players who brought us to this point are still pushing. And there's no guarantee that an act of miscalculation could lead to not just a war between Russia and Ukraine, but a global thermonuclear confrontation. And the third crisis spot is China, and I'll have a couple remarks on that. But let's start with the situation in Syria, because this is one that is so outrageous that it cries out for justice, as Mrs. LaRouche said. I think Dennis mentioned this, that she referred to the statement from Cardinal Zanari, who talks about how the new sanctions against Syria have put 90% of the population there under the poverty level. This is a population that has been subjected to a dirty war, largely conducted by forces armed and trained by the United States, that is, the so-called jihadists. And there's a long history of this that goes back to the original Afghan war against the Soviet Union. But in the more recent period, as former NSA director to Trump, Michael Flynn, who used to head the Defense Intelligence Agency, pointed out, the United States armed and trained through the CIA and other mercenary forces the jihadists that destroyed Syria. And at the same time, the intelligence establishment blamed the Assad government for the destruction of the nation, the killing of people. And so we'll take a quick look at that. But here's what Helga Zepp-LaRouche said. She talked about the so-called Caesar sanctions, and I'll explain those in a moment. But she said there's nothing humanitarian in starving children and shutting down hospitals and medical care based on fraudulent narratives cooked up by British and American regime change advocates. She said, this must stop, and the sanctions must be lifted. And all the members of the US Congress who do not lift these sanctions make themselves complicit in every death that occurs in the region. And she said, this has reached the point where either the world wakes up and we start to remedy this, or we will not survive because of our own moral failure as a human species. I call on you, she said in conclusion, work with the Schiller Institute, work with its Committee on the Coincidence of Opposites, which is working to get aid programs and reconstruction. I appeal to you get in contact with the Schiller Institute and respond to the call by Cardinal Zanari. Now, what we're about to look at is what are the Caesar sanctions that have been implemented that are killing off the children in the population of Syria. But I want you to see the face of the policy. Secretary of State Blinken, when he talks about how the sanctions are an act of humanitarianism. Dave, do we have that video clip?
Look, we all sit in these chairs. We speak these words. We represent our countries. But how is it possible that we can't find in our hearts the common humanity to actually take meaningful action to do something? How is that possible? I have 2 young children of my own. I suspect many members of this council have young children or grandchildren. I think of my kids when I think of the Syrian children we've heard talked about today. I ask you to do the same thing. Think of yours, look into your hearts, and then talk to your colleagues. And despite our differences, we have to find a way to do something, to take action, to help people. That is our responsibility. And shame on us if we don't meet it.
That is the Secretary of State of the United States, Antony Blinken. And what's he talking about as the action they should take that you would want for your own children? He can't be serious, because the action of these new sanctions that actually were introduced in June of 2020, these sanctions are killing the people of Syria. They're denying them food, medicine, parts that are needed to run the economy. And this is an intentional policy. Now, where did this come from? How can a Secretary of State say something like that, where he talks about protecting his own children when he's conducting policies that are putting millions of children's lives in danger in Syria? That's what Cardinal Zanari referred to. That's what Helga Zepp-LaRouche has called on you to act to protect those children from the face of evil that you just saw with Secretary of State Blinken. Now, the Caesar Act was passed in June 2020. It was named after a mysterious figure, supposedly a photographer of the Syrian government, who became a defector, who brought with him a portfolio of 50-some thousand photos of supposedly 28,000 people who were killed in the Syrian civil war. And these were people whose bodies were mutilated, very horrible pictures to look at. And this was then delivered to a group called the Syrian National Movement, which is funded in part by Qatar, the nation of Qatar. And they took this and gave it to the Human Rights Watch, a notorious part of the human rights mafia that's committed to regime change in any country that goes against the rules-based order. The Human Rights Watch narrowed it down to an 86-page report with more than 28,000 photos. The report was titled, "If the Dead Could Speak, Mass Deaths and Torture in Syria's Detention Facilities." And this was then presented before the Congress in 2 different meetings during 2014. Now, the person who was given the name Caesar appeared before the committee. And what did he say? He said, these are the pictures of people killed by the regime, the Assad government. And yet, the story is that supposedly Human Rights Watch meticulously worked to determine who these pictures were. And they said, we've identified about 30 people who were arrested by the government, taken to detention centers, tortured, and killed. 30 out of 6,000? They admit that almost half of the pictures were of Syrian soldiers killed by the jihadists, by the terrorists, by ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Others were civilians who were victims of bombing attacks, car bombs, assassinations. And others were foreign jihadis who were killed in battle by government forces. That's hardly an example of mass genocide of civilians conducted by the government. So who's behind this Caesar report? Well, here's where you find the usual British and American gang of the usual criminals. A man named David Crane, a former DIA operative with a military intelligence background, who leads the Syrian Accountability Project. Another very prominent person is Muaz Mustafa, the director of the State Department-funded Syria Emergency Task Force. He was the one who sat next to Caesar when he spoke before the Congress. Caesar, by the way, was covered in a hood so no one could see who he was, so it was very dramatic. But who is this Mustafa? He's the person who took John McCain to Syria on a so-called fact-finding mission, where McCain was photographed standing next to ISIS and Al-Qaeda-linked terrorists. Also involved in this was someone named Stephen Rapp, a former Obama official who was an ambassador at large for criminal justice. And he presented the Caesar file as an exhibit at the U.S. Holocaust Museum. What was the point they were trying to make? This is a Holocaust being conducted by the Assad government. And then you had two other attorneys who helped prepare the project. One was a man misnamed Sir Geoffrey Nice, not a very nice person. He's the former lead prosecutor in the case against former Yugoslav President Milosevic. He was paid by the Qatari government. There was also Desmond De Silva, another British attorney, also on the payroll of Qatar. What this sanctions bill did was convince the majority of the Congress of something they were already committed to, destroying Syria as a sovereign nation. Why? Because Assad didn't reflect the interests of the rules-based order. Here's James Jeffrey, who is the person assigned as the special representative for Syrian engagement in the Trump administration. He said his job was to make Syria a quagmire for Russia. And when it came to the question of the Caesar sanctions, he said the point of these is to make it clear to anyone who wants to rebuild Assad's Syria that that cannot happen without Caesar sanctions. That is, if anyone intends to invest in Syria, any company, any individual, they will be subject to these sanctions. So this is what was Tony Blinken talking about, the great humanitarianism of a policy which is designed to kill people based on a completely false narrative. Now, this question of the false narrative is what we see also when it comes to Ukraine. What's the story with Ukraine? The Russians are mobilizing. The Russians are about to invade Crimea. Well, in fact, Crimea had a plebiscite and they voted by 90% to rejoin Russia. They're about to go into the Donbass region and carry out a war against Ukraine. And so therefore, we have a new crisis. President Zelensky of Ukraine, who's very much under pressure from the right-wing forces in his government, which include neo-Nazis from the Azov battalion, from the Pravi sector, people who are committed to an ethnic cleansing of Ukraine, which means getting rid of Russian ethnics, getting rid of Hungarians, Romanians, probably Jews, because that's what they did in World War II when their grandfathers worked with the Nazis. Now, what's the special point about Ukraine? Joe Biden was the point person for the coup in February 2014 in Ukraine, which was a regime change coup, which brought into power these networks, which included Nazis who were conducting assassinations and sniper attacks on Maidan Square in February 2014. Biden personally intervened on behalf of regime change networks, which included the George Soros-funded operations, the International Republican Institute, the National Endowment for Democracy, Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland, the notorious neocon, and the neo-Nazis. This is who made the coup, and this is who we're defending now. And so Zelensky on March 24th said that the Ukrainian government intends to take back Crimea. So there was a Russian mobilization in Crimea and in the Donbass, not in the Donbass, but on the border in Russia, not in Ukraine. And when they were asked, why are you threatening Ukraine? The Russians say, we're having military exercises in our country. Zelensky went to Biden and said, why are we not in NATO yet? He talked to Trudeau. He talked to Boris Johnson of Britain. He talked to Jens Stoltenberg, the General Secretary of NATO, and demanded Ukraine be brought into NATO. For the Russians, this would be crossing a red line. This was being pushed at the same point we were about to send 2 destroyers into the Black Sea, which would have been crossing another red line. At the same time, we have the Defender Europe 2021 exercises, the largest in many, many years. And a Ukrainian official in the so-called Trilateral Contact Group said the purpose of these exercises is to prepare for war with Russia. That's why the tension became so great at this point over Ukraine and Russia, so that Tulsi Gabbard could warn credibly that we could have a nuclear war. Now, finally, in terms of China, I'm not going to go through the details, but you have the fraudulent story of Xinjiang province, which is being promoted by, among others, the Jamestown Foundation, a notorious right-wing neoconservative outfit currently headed by Admiral Michael Hayden. You have the the military buildup aimed at the Taiwan Strait and also the South China Sea. You have the so-called Quad agreement, which the Biden administration seemed to be moving toward a military force, an Asian NATO, so to speak. And you have people like Boris Johnson saying, we want to be a part of this. So a buildup as part of a containment of China, a military containment. And what's the threat from China? The Belt and Road Initiative. Now, let me point out that while this is going on, most of you are not hearing the whole story. What I've given you is only a part of it. And if you go to my blog page on the LaRouche Organization site, you'll see articles by me the last 2 weeks on Ukraine and just coming out now on the Syria Caesar sanctions. But what's important to note is there is opposition coming from certain military sectors, realist sectors, you might say. Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson said that our policy is strategically inept, stupid, and crazy. Wilkerson, you may remember, was the aide to Colin Powell when he was Secretary of State. Douglas McGregor, who was an aide to the last defense secretary under Trump, McGregor said, this is a crazy policy. It could end up in a nuclear war by accident. The veteran intelligence for professionals for sanity, who many of you know, people like Bill Binney, Ray McGovern, put out their own statement saying, pull back from this. You have the Tulsi Gabbard statement. Remember, Gabbard is a military vet. And then you have Lyle Goldstein, a China expert, professor at the Naval War College, who said that the policy towards China is absolutely crazy and could lead us to a war that we could not win as a conventional war, and we would be forced to go nuclear if we were going to win. So the question comes up, and this is what Mrs. LaRouche is asking. Why is there no general public outcry? Yes, the media is corrupt. You're not getting the story. But you are getting it from us. It is getting out there. Many people don't believe the media anymore. They don't believe the government and the officials. The false flags behind these, like the so-called Syrian use of chemical weapons, that's been exposed. The whole question of the bounty the Russians supposedly placed on U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan, even Biden had to admit that that story has no legs. You have the whole Russiagate story, which has been debunked. Although people like Adam Schiff and Nancy Pelosi haven't gotten the memo yet, they're still saying Russia, Russia, Russia. And then Biden, even while he announced his desire to have a summit within the next couple of months with President Putin to address these things, came out and attacked the Russians on the so-called solar wind act, for which there's been no evidence presented. The interference in the 2020 election, again, no evidence presented. The threat to shut down the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, well, Biden said that's still up in the air. And then what do we also hear? The buzzwords, constantly repeated, that Russia and China are malign actors. They're bullies. They're encroaching on their neighbors. China is setting a debt trap, which has now been completely exposed as a fraud. The debt trap, by the way, is from our bankers through the International Monetary Fund. That China and Russia are aggressive. And finally, almost hilarious, is that they're violating the rules-based order. Well, who sets the rules? Is it a rule that if you don't like a government, you can kill its children, the way we did in Iraq with the sanctions that the Clinton administration implemented in the 90s, with the wars that the Bush administration and Obama administration carried out, with the sanctions policy now being conducted against Syria? Is that part of the rules? And keep in mind what Blinken said. He thinks of his children when he orders these actions, which he calls humanitarian. So how does this happen? And I'm just going to be very brief in this, but this is a form of brainwashing of the American people, not just by the media repeating these lies, but by a longer-term process set in motion at the end of World War II, with such institutions of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the Frankfurt School, and other institutions, the Tavistock Institution, that studied how can you undermine the American Republic by using its culture against them, to brainwash them. Now, the reason I say it's brainwashing is many people know it's lies, that it's all fake. But what happens is the rage is directed into less systemic questions, away from the big picture issues, which seem to be too hard to address. Instead, we have the silliness of a call to solve the problem of election fraud by boycotting Coca-Cola and Major League Baseball, because that's easy to do. Baseball has become boring. Coca-Cola is not very good for you. Is that going to change the country? You want to change the country, you have to change the axioms, and as Mrs. LaRouche keeps emphasizing, create a new paradigm. So when you look at the big picture, how was this brainwashing conducted? And I'll just refer you to something that when I first met Lyndon LaRouche, he was talking about quite often. It was a book called The Lonely Crowd that came out in 1950 by a sociologist named David Reisman. Now, he's not the only one who presented this kind of work, but he was working with groups such as the Frankfurt School, Theodor Adorno, Hannah Arendt, to carry out an attack on the idea of the American constitutional republic. So what did they identify as the problem? They identified the problem as what LaRouche said, is the individual belief in the sacredness of each human being and the creative potential of each human being. But they didn't say that. What they said is that the problem is people are other-directed. That is, in Reisman's terms, he said that you have the struggle to be an individual will cause people to submit, that people become willing, what the term he used was other-directed. You're more interested in what your neighbor thinks than what's right. Now, this is true, but this was programmed into people. And who programmed it? Madison Avenue. There's a very interesting study, which is written by Thomas Frank on this, about how Madison Avenue took the concept of rugged individualism and the youth culture to sell a new culture, to acclimate people to the idea of capitulating to these trends. For example, the Marlboro Man is the rugged individual, or Pepsi's famous commercial, for those who think young. But what was Reisman really working at? He took up the question of the shift that's underway from a society based on production to one shaped by the market orientation of a consumer culture, and that people's fear of being an outcast would lead them to seek approval. So what did you have with the youth culture? All of a sudden, every individual felt compelled to grow their hair long, wear bell bottoms and tie-dye, and smoke pot. Was that an individual rebellion? A rebellion against the rules? Well, it was something easy to do, because what was going on in the 60s? You actually had real political fights. You had the civil rights movement. You had the battle against the Vietnam War. But those got intermingled to create an other-directed movement among youth. the idea that hipness is now cool. And to be cool, you have to oppose the war. But the way to oppose it is smoke pot and grow your hair long and maybe threaten to go to Canada if you're going to be drafted. And virtually everyone on college campuses was thinking that way. That's individualism. So if you think about this, if you think about the way this was used to direct a whole generation to actually be other directed rather than inner directed, because being inner directed is hard. It means to be committed to principle. But that's the fight we have to wage. It's not enough just to be opposed to some bad guys. You have to have a program that will work, a strategy that will work. And it means you have to know who the enemy is, what their intention is, and how to outflank them. And that's what we do in the LaRouche movement. And you'll hear from Hussein in a moment how it is that we're working to ensure that this happens, to turn Southwest Asia from a confrontation point of a geopolitical war into a paradise. So that's what I wanted to present today, and I'll be standing by for your questions.
Thank you very much, Harley. We're going to go right to Hussein Askary, Southwest Asia Coordinator for the Schiller Institute. It's got a two-part presentation. What we're going to do is do the first part and then take a pause and see if either Harley or Diane has a response. So we can go right to Hussein.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this very important meeting to discuss the situation in Southwest Asia, with special emphasis on the situation in Syria. Syria, where, as Mrs. Helga Tsep-LaRouche, the chairwoman of the Schiller Institute, has emphasized in recent days, is that what's going on there through the US and British and other EU-imposed sanctions, especially the US so-called Caesar sanctions imposed on Syria, are a form of, it's a crime against humanity, it's a form of genocide, and it should be stopped. The reality is that the fact that the Syrian people and their leadership defeated the terrorists who were backed by the United States, Britain, and other European countries have angered these forces. And now they are using starvation as a way of subduing the Syrian people and their leadership to submit to the political will of the what we call Anglo-American Empire or these other forces. Now, the same thing is happening in Yemen, where the Yemeni people have resisted now 6 years of a terrible war, but also a blockade, which is forcing 19 million people into starvation. And this is also another case of genocide. Now, the issue is we have the possibility of a population reduction in this region. But this, as I have argued earlier, this is not going to, subdue those people. It's not going to change their will. And therefore, it's very important that we mobilize to stop this incredibly insane policy, which will not be productive for anybody. Now, the way we look at things in the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche movement is not only solving problems negatively, like stopping the war and the blockade on Syria and Yemen, as we deal with other problems, but we look at it also from a positive standpoint. As Mr. Lyndon LaRouche have said often, if you try to tackle a problem without having a solution, you will end up having existential problems. You'll keep going in the same vicious cycle without having any hope of reaching another destination with a better result. So therefore, when we look even in the situation in Syria now and what the United States specifically have been doing, we look at it from the standpoint of what we have suggested as an alternative to that policy through our plans for the reconstruction of Syria, as we did with Yemen and other areas. I would like to share with you a few thoughts and from our own work in Syria, and from that, I will try to go through both the problem, but also the solution of the problem. As you know, this region, which is people call the Middle East, we call it Southwest Asia. Mr. Lyndon LaRouche has called it the crossroads of the continents. And in the context of the new Silk Road strategy or the Belt and Road Initiative, this region has, as LaRouche argued, very important role in connecting the continents of the world and the oceans of the world. Now, while the war was going on in Syria, we published a reconstruction plan, a preliminary reconstruction plan for Syria, which is called the Operation Phoenix, because Syria, like the bird of Phoenix, will come out of the ashes of the war and fly again, and therefore we called it this name. But as we know from Mr. LaRouche's work is on the question of economics, the most important source of wealth is population, and therefore we looked at, when we were putting these plans in 2015, at where the Syrian people, the majority of the Syrian people live, what kind of activities. As we see here, most of the population live in the western part of the country and the large cities where you have industrial activities. Now, the irony is that most of the agricultural land in Syria is located in the northeast, which is less populated, close to the river of the Euphrates, but also to the east of that area, you have the river, the Tigris. So therefore, this area is called the Jazeera, means the island. And the region of Hasaka is the most important agricultural activity area in Egypt. Now, if we look at the production of wheat, and all these things we studied in preparation for our reconstruction plan to see the human and natural resources and other activities of Syria. Now you see that the biggest concentration of wheat production, which is the base of the staple food in Syria, is located in the same area, in the northeast, in the Hasaka region and adjacent regions. Now, this region now is occupied or controlled by the US forces and their allies, Kurdish, so-called Kurdish democratic forces and so on. And also part of it is controlled by Turkey, which is a NATO member. Now, the United States, in addition to the sanctions, which have prevented Syria from, and also the British and the EU have supported sanctions against Syria so that Syria cannot reconstruct its economy, but also is not allowed to import medicines and food. And even the neighboring countries of Syria can be punished by these sanctions if they allow food and medicine to get into Syria. Now, in addition to that, US forces have been shipping out of this very important agricultural area, taking wheat and other grains from the silos in the Hasaka, shipping them on trucks into Iraq, and from Iraq they were sold to Turkish merchants and others. In this area too, we have the biggest concentration of Syria's oil and gas fields, which the Syrians cannot use now for heating, for electricity and other sources. So Syria's resources, in addition to being strangled, their resources are being stolen from them. In addition, Turkey, a few days ago, we got the reports that Turkey is using its huge dams on the Euphrates River to block the flow of water into Syria. And now we have another humanitarian disaster for the lack of even drinking water for big parts of Syria and consequently also for Iraq. But also that the people who will grow food in these areas will not have enough water to grow the food for their crops. So in this sense, this is a kind of genocide being practiced against the people of Syria. And it's in this context that we have to mobilize to stop both the insane sanctions, but also this stealing of the wealth of the Syrian nation. Now, in addition to this total disaster, which we can say that if we manage to do that, we will be able to put Syria back on the path of reconstruction. And actually, we, in 2016, when the Syrian forces managed to liberate Aleppo, which is the most important industrial city in Syria, we made a documentary on this, our Operation Felix, for the reconstruction of Syria and connecting Syria to the new Silk Road. The documentary is called Aleppo, the Eternal City, because Aleppo, as like Damascus, is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. So people have inhabited this city and this region for more than 10,000 years without any breaks. So in that context, we presented this plan to the Syrian government, and also we have been advocating that plan for connecting Syria to the new Silk Road and utilizing all the human and natural resources and the geographical position of Syria in the reconstruction process. Now, ironically, Syria before the war had a very productive economy. It was self-sufficient in food, and it was actually exporting wheat to other countries. That was in 2009, which was the peak. But also Syria had an industrial base and was developing a modern industrial base. As we see here, this is the main headquarters of the industrial city in Aleppo, north of Aleppo, which was built in 2011, just exactly before the war broke out. And this is the main building of the industrial city. It's called Sheikh Najjar City. And the US and the British supported forces turned this whole place into rubble. And the big industry, especially the textile industry, all the machinery was stolen and shipped to Turkey. So these are the forces, so-called democratic forces supported by the United States and the EU done to that city. Now, the interesting thing is that immediately after the liberation of Aleppo, the Syrian government and engineers and other industrial corporations, they managed to bring back electricity to Aleppo and rebuild this industrial center, especially the textile sector, which is very, very advanced actually. And they managed to bring back some of the machinery, import some of it, and things started to work again until 2018, 2019, and also managed to bring back an important part of the labor force back to work. So it was this process that the Syrians have proven that if you establish peace and you allow certain kinds of technologies and machinery to come back into the country, they will once again become self-sufficient in both agricultural and industrial production. So it is this which have angered the ability of the Syrian people and their leadership to rebuild big parts of Aleppo, rebuild the industry, bring life back. That actually frustrated the enemies of Syria, and therefore we had a new round of sanctions under the Trump administration, pushed by State Secretary Pompeo, to strangle the Syrian people, and by starving them, for trying to force them to submit to the will of the United States and its allies. So
yeah, we're going to just take a break here because I think that Diane has a response to what she's seen, and when Harley, if you've got something, we'll also go to you. But Diane, I think you're muted.
Oh, somehow I was, yes. What strikes me is that people often say in the United States, well, first we have to help ourselves and then we can help other people. Or they say, why are we spending all this money helping people overseas when we're not spending money here? Well, I think what has been presented should indicate we are not spending money helping people overseas, unless you considered bombing them to smithereens and stealing their food and oil a peculiar way of helping them. But in fact, what we are doing to people overseas is what we are doing to people in the United States. And I think this really gets to the Confucian, Christian, otherwise universal principle of do unto others as you would have done unto you, or don't do to others what you would not have them do to you, or people say what goes around comes around. If we change our policy, if we were to take urgent action in the interest of what happens to people in Syria, Yemen, and other places, I think people would be very surprised to discover that our actions on behalf of the American people internally would also shift. And the last thing on that I just want to say, which has not been brought up, but I consider directly related in keeping with the point, Dennis, that you made at the beginning about the question of humanity first, mankind first, then what our nation can do with regard to that. If you take the situation with the vaccines, we have now coming from Brazil new strains that are of COVID that are more and more vaccine resistant. So you can say, well, President Biden said we're going to protect all Americans first by hoarding the vaccine and keeping it here, even in greater amounts than we have people willing to be vaccinated. And everybody can get vaccinated, and then you do nothing about Brazil, and you get new strains coming back into the United States that are able to, infect people in spite of the vaccines. So it really is, the universe is lawfully composed. And it is the case, as Lyndon LaRouche said, that every human being has a divine potential, and that all policy has to flow from recognition of that. And if you decide to deny that as a universal principle, then what you are doing is sowing the seeds of your own destruction.
Okay. Harley, you have anything that you want to add at this point?
Yeah, I just want to call people's attention to what happened this last week with the global Green New Deal. Because as we've been emphasizing week after week, the people who are pushing these policies are not doing it from a position of strength, but a position of weakness. They know there's opposition in the United States to shutting down industry, to shifting to a solar and wind powered, inefficient, expensive system. But the American people, unfortunately, are not speaking out enough. But here's what happened that was interesting in terms of the international side of things. The climate czar, John Kerry, flew to India to convince the Indian government that they have to join the Green New Deal. They have to go to a net zero carbon emissions, shut down industry, shift out of coal into so-called renewables, and so on. And the Indian energy minister said, well, we think if you want to do that, that's fine for you. But that's not what we want. And speaking on behalf of 800 million Africans, they don't want that either. They want economic development. And then Kerry thought he would go over the head of Energy Minister Singh and went to meet with Prime Minister Modi, who made the same point. Well, maybe by 2050 we'll take this up, but right now we're committed to development. And so then Kerry, after this, was supposed to go to China and make sure the Chinese participated in President Biden's Earth Day summit. And instead, the Chinese made it clear they were going to talk to France and Germany about these questions, but it's still unclear whether they'll participate in Biden's summit. Now, what this shows you is that all this military bluffing and threatening and this idea that we're standing up against the bullies, Russia and China, that in fact we are the bully. And by we, I mean the Anglo-Americans, the NATO included, trying to impose what they're calling a rules-based order, which could be more properly called a unilateral regime run out of Washington and London. And it's not going to work. It's not going to work because of the flaws in their own system, because these bubble economies never succeed. But it's also not going to work because it's not going to be supported by other countries. And this brings us to LaRouche's proposal. Instead of trying to bully other countries into accepting a destruction of their physical economies, we should instead work together to, on the basis of common interests, to move into the new regime of science and technology that can provide energy from fusion power, from plasma technologies, that will take us out of the so-called scarcity into an unlimited future. And this can be done, but it's going to take a shift in thinking of the American people along the lines of what Diane was just saying, to understand that the strength of the United States is not our military power and our ability to run the world on the basis of the dollar, which is collapsing, but to provide a moral standard of a Republican constitutional system that puts the interests of the general welfare of its population first and recognizes that those interests cannot be solved or realized without allowing other countries not only to do the same, but to do them in cooperation.
Okay, so what we're going to do is going to go back to Hussein's presentation, and then he will be joining us for the discussion at the conclusion of what he has here.
Allies. So it is this irony of the ability to, build the potential for life, a potential for future, with much less effort than the effort to destroy the massive deployment of military force to destroy a nation. So with much less than that, the people could actually rebuild their country and make life flourish again. So it's this kind of frustration by the part of people, like Pompeo and others, but also the British ideology behind them, which says that population growth, technological advancement are a source of danger. It's like the same way they treat China today, that China's economic growth and modernization is a threat to the United States. I don't understand how that could be a threat to the United States when people improve their living conditions. But obviously, this is against an ideology which has become ingrained into the British Empire kind of thinking. And it takes different forms. And one of the forms it has taken in recent decades, which is targeting even industrial nations like the United States, is this green ideology. And this green ideology has its background, of course, in the British Empire and what we call the Malthusian thinking. This, according to Thomas Malthus, an ideologue of the British East India Company, whose theory is that human population can grow much faster than the agricultural production or resources, natural resources development. So therefore, population has to be reduced. And now when somebody comes to these Malthusians, they say, well, humans can solve that problem by technological advancement. You can grow more food from the same plot of land using more modern technology. So their answer is, well, we should forbid technological advancement. And this is what is in the Green Reset, because unless you stop technological development and industrialization, of course, you will not be able to advance. And therefore, even the Green Reset is as a way of population reduction and mass, basically genocide. Now, I want to take another example from the same region to show how you can reverse these processes. And I'm going to talk about Egypt, which is actually gives us some hope that things don't necessarily have to go wrong the whole time, but what is needed is a shift in the thinking. Now, Egypt was one of the countries which were targeted by the Arab Spring, and they were destined to become controlled after the previous government was overthrown of the Hosni Mubarak presidency, that the Muslim Brotherhood, President Obama's and the British friends, that they will take over Egypt and then will turn Egypt into a bastion for this Islamic ideology, and which actually happened in 2012. And then the Muslim Brotherhood won the elections. And then they suddenly started going from being democratic to being more and more extreme, and even called on people to join the fight, jihad in Syria, and support the Syrian terrorist groups. So in that moment, the Egyptian people and an important institution, which is the military, said, enough is enough. We cannot accept this. We have to save our country, our constitution, and our society. And therefore, there was a new revolt in Egypt in 2013, where the military supported the population, and then the former head of the army, al-Sisi, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, became president, or provisional president, but then he was elected by the people as president. And a new process took hold in Egypt. Now, Egypt was also one of the 15 nations who were destined for population reduction in accordance to a US National Security Study Memorandum commissioned by Henry Kissinger in 1974 as National Security Advisor. It's called National Security Study Memorandum 200, which considered population growth in developing nations as a national security threat to the United States and its allies. Now, the theory is that population growth in many countries, and they name 15 countries, including Egypt, but you have Ethiopia, Bangladesh, and others, that what will happen with the population growth is that the governments of these countries will be forced to go to advanced technologies to be able to fulfill the needs of those people. And that consequently will lead to these nations using the natural resources they have in their regions for their own development. And that will deprive us and our allies of these natural resources, which we need. And therefore, it was necessary to help those nations stop the population growth. Now, this is also one of the themes of the Malthusians in the British Empire, like Julian Huxley, who was the advocate of eugenics, the Nazi eugenics in Britain. But after World War II, they had to come with a new name for these for the same ideology of population reduction. And they came up with the idea that there was a population explosion after World War II, and also because of the advancement of vaccines and better healthcare, that the world population will explode, and that would be the biggest threat to nature and humanity. So Egypt was targeted by US policies to reduce the population, and the organizations like USAID poured hundreds of millions of dollars into Egypt for family planning programs, for birth control, and so on and so forth. But that didn't really help. What happened in the same period is that Egypt was, its economy was taken over by the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, and Egypt, which a country which was in the 60s and 70s self-sufficient in food, became gradually becoming an importer of food. There was no more industrial development as was happening in the 60s and early 70s, and Egypt became a poorer and poorer country. And at the same time, you had a massive also population growth. So there are many ironies in Egypt, but also that the proof of what Mr. LaRouche calls, which is the opposite of the Malthusian idea, which is LaRouche defines, the relative potential population density, which a concept which is based on not simply counting the population and the land, that you need scientific criteria for defining the relationship of the population to the land relative to the quality of the land, but also to the technology that exists in that society and the possibility of developing that technology to make sure that potentially you can sustain more people on that land with a higher living standard and sustain that process. So that's what LaRouche calls the relative potential population density, which is a key criteria of judging economic policies. So I want to share with you what is going on what has been going on in Egypt. Now, some people say that now this is a demographic map of Egypt. In 2019, the Egyptian population reached 100 million individuals. Now, at the time, you had articles in New York Times and other newspapers, even in Egyptian newspapers, that this is a disaster. The country cannot have so many people. The country is poor, it has no resources, and so on and so forth. Now, the irony is that when people count population density, they divide the population by the land area of the country. So they say 100 million people divided by 1 million square kilometers, the area of Egypt. That gives us a population density of 100 people per square kilometer. Now, the problem is that the 100 million Egyptians live on and of just 7% of the land area of the country. So in reality, the Egyptian people live on only 70,000 square kilometers. That's 7% of the whole land area. Everybody is jammed around the Nile River and the Delta. That's the historically productive part of the country. So the real population density in this case, it's not 100 people per square kilometer. It should be 1,428 people per square kilometer. So now, to deal with this problem, of course, now everybody says, well, this is the proof that we have overpopulation because you have too many people living in a small area. Now, the problem is that people neglect the rest of the country, which can be utilized for improving the living standards. And there's this another ironical thing which Mr. LaRouche used to say is that if we apply modern technology, advancements in technology, we could have many times more of the world population living less crowded and with a better living standard, which is a big paradox for a lot of people. But Egypt could be the proof. We can prove it already now that this is what's going on in Egypt, because Egypt will have more people, but they will live less crowded and will have a better living standard. Now, these are some of the plans, both in terms of industrial infrastructure, but also agriculture. Now, as you all know, Egypt built the new president in 2014, commissioned the building of a second Suez Canal, and it was financed domestically too, which was a breakthrough in the sense that you can actually create national credit. You don't need the IMF or World Bank or foreign creditors to develop your country. So the money was raised by the Egyptian people, by Egyptian institutions to build the canal, which is a very important international freight route. And we all saw that huge crisis when this container ship was stuck in the Suez Canal, but the Egyptians managed to salvage it actually very quickly. So, but around the Suez Canal, Egypt is building on both sides, on on the African side and on the Asian side in Sinai, new industrial zones and new cities. At the same time, Egypt is connecting its infrastructure with highways, with high-speed railway, which is on the way now for construction, and also building a new Nile Valley, this black line here, which is an idea of the Egyptian-American scientist Farouk El-Baz. So he wants to build new cities, new urban centers along the Nile, but in the Western Desert. At the same time, there will be development of these oases as new agricultural land. Now, under this whole desert area, there are massive groundwater aquifers that could be utilized, of course, with modern technology to grow food, more food than Egypt needs to consume and even export part of it. So there is now a plan by the Egyptian government to expand and build new towns and cities in these series of oases for both agriculture but also industrial centers. So now you have young people taking loans to build farms in these areas, and the government builds housing, hospitals, or healthcare center and schools for their children. So the population is expanding both east and west. Now, we have also, this is the Egyptian government first signed an agreement with the Chinese company to build a high-speed railway from the Gulf of Suez, all the way a 350 kilometer to a new city in Al Alamein being built there to connect the east and west of the country, because Egypt is only connected north-south with railways, but this will be a high-speed rail to connect the new industrial zones on the Suez to the new cities in the west. Now here on the way, there is a new capital, which I will discuss, the Egyptians are building. Now this is a picture of the President el-Sisi with the head of the Siemens, who came to compete with the Chinese and actually offered a much lower price and export loans from Germany for building this high-speed railway, and the Egyptian government, of course, accepted the offer. So this is some sort of a Sputnik moment where competition between China and Europe is actually benefiting those countries. Now, what else Egypt is doing is they are moving the capital from Cairo, which is overcrowded with very old infrastructure, to a new capital 40 kilometers outside of Egypt on the way to the Suez region and this Ain al-Sukhna port, which is a new industrial zone. And as I explained, there will be a high-speed railway going through the new capital all the way to the west of the country. And also there are new urban centers being built here. Now this new capital will house 7 million people, and it's being completed right now. It took only 4 to 5 years now to build a state, carve it out of the desert, a state-of-the-art modern city. There is no such project, I think, not only in Africa, but probably in the whole world, where a 7 million inhabitant modern city being built all at once. And here there are some satellite images of how it was in 2013 and how it is emerging out of the desert. This was complete desert. This is another image, 2013, and now this is the presidential palace and part of the government building. And here are also new centers. In the center of the city, there is this commercial center or business center. It's being built by Chinese companies. It will also have the highest towers in Africa. So this whole city, which is rising from the sands of the desert, is the largest workshop maybe on the planet, but also it has helped Egypt in the middle of the corona crisis, because you have tens of thousands of people working there. The work did not stop. So that was an important part of the economic survival of Egypt. Now, this is a future image of how the center of the city would look like. This is the central park, and so on and so forth. There will be a massive mosque, but also a cathedral, Christian cathedral, symbolizing the coexistence between Christians and Muslims. There will be a modern opera and a modern museum built in the city there. So this is driving some people crazy in Washington. I've seen seminars and articles saying that the Egyptian president has gone crazy. He's squandering the nation's resources to build presidential palaces, which is not true. They're building a 7 million inhabitant city, which is quite necessary and important for Egypt. Now, Egypt at the same time is investing in high technology. This is in this spot in the west of Egypt. This is not really inhabited area. They have established maybe the only of its kind high school for teaching nuclear technology. It's a high school. These kids go there as 16 years old. And it takes around 80 to 90 students each year. It started already in 2017. And these are the best students. They go through a series of tests before they are admitted to the school, including, importantly, language skills with English, for example. So they will get a modern technical education, and in a few years, we will have like hundreds and maybe thousands of those young people who are educated in nuclear technology and technical matters related to nuclear technology. Some of them, of course, will continue their higher education in universities, but what these young people are being prepared is to do the technical work in this Al-Dab'a nuclear complex, which Egypt and Russia have agreed to build. The work commenced this year. It's a massive nuclear complex with 4 nuclear reactors with 1,250 megawatts each. So these young people will be working in this place and then becoming experts in this field, and which can help also other African nations in cooperation with Russia, China, or if the Western countries become more wise. So this is the kind of thing which is going on, which must be very, very frustrating for people like Kissinger, Prince Philip, who just passed away, who might walk to the grave with a very bitter taste in their mouth that their schemes to prove the Malthusian idea didn't really work. Because with modern economic planning and development, and with a completely positive idea of the future, and that human beings and children are not a burden over nature and society, but they are an important resource that could develop and then will contribute to the development of society, and developing new resources which were earlier not known to society, and develop new land areas. So we have more people who live less crowded and with a higher living standard. And I think this is a fantastic proof of Lyndon LaRouche's argument against these Malthusians, who we can call their ideology as satanic because it's anti-human in that sense. So I think with this kind of example we have, our ability to shift the situation in this region and in the world into a positive direction, if we look at these matters from a scientific and humanist viewpoint, we can solve problems. Nations can coexist and everybody can win. And therefore, the idea of the New Silk Road or the Belt and Road Initiative, this idea of win-win, is really can be proven economically, scientifically, and seeing how it affects the living conditions of people and their capabilities. So I think this whole criminal policy against Syria and Yemen and other nations have to stop. And the provocations to start new wars and probably a new world war is the most stupid and insane thing you can do, because you can do much, much, much better with economic cooperation, with scientific development, rather than with all these wars. And but what is important is to take away this, cancel the Malthusian British Empire ideology, and put humanity on a different path for economic development and peace. And I think this is what I thought could contribute to the discussion now, that we can stop the war, but we can also chart the road to a new path for these nations and for humanity in general. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Hussein. So what we're going to do now is go right to our discussion. And I think Hussein is with us. Okay, right. We got him. We don't have a video, but we have an audio. So first, let me just welcome you to the discussion and just see if there's anything you want to add to what you've already said.
This is Hussein.
Yes. Did you hear? Did you hear me? Yes.
Yes. No, I think you might have noticed that in the middle of all these, terrible conditions in the region I work with, I sound very optimistic, and that's not only a survival technique, which I learned from being an Iraqi living through all these wars. I mean, the Jews had that technique too. They use humor to survive all the misery they had gone through. But one important thing, which I think is we have to always remember, when Lynn discussed this in the beginning of this program in his discussion with these civil rights leaders, is the question of pessimism. And pessimism is killing us. And as Harley explained, this was a systematic way of making people more pessimistic. And especially when the American people become pessimistic, that was the goal. Because, Americans, what is exceptional about American, there's a stupid idea about American exceptionalism, but I think what is exceptional, or has been since maybe I've studied Franklin Roosevelt's time in the 30s, and later with the space program, that when the Americans put their mind to something good, they do it, they achieve it, even if it sounds impossible in the beginning. And that has been lost. And the cultural chaos and degeneration we see, and which Mrs. Helga Septarush is pointing at right now in this crisis in Europe and the United States, is a result of that pessimism, because this whole green ideology, the Great Reset, the climate change, is feeding into this pessimism, which tells people that they as humans are a destructive force, they are parasites in nature, and every more baby born is a plague, is a problem. So now, as Harley and Dennis said, you look at the world from India or China or Africa, they say, well, what you are talking about is a pie in the sky, all this green stuff. We have real life and death problems we need to solve. We want to improve the living conditions of our people, and we know how it is done. And guess what? Who is now having that exceptionalism in the world? It's the Chinese. This was American tendency. Now it's a Chinese tendency. The Chinese say, if there's something good we want to do, we will achieve it. And they put a plan for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 50 years, and be sure they will achieve those goals, exactly as the Americans achieved those goals with Franklin Roosevelt or with Kennedy. So this pessimism is what is destroying people's ability to get out of this contained political environment where the mass media, the politicians can brainwash people or just make them passive, that they cannot do anything, that the world is going under and you cannot do anything. And I think this is a real cultural problem. It's not simply a political problem, but it's a cultural problem.
I have one question from some friends of mine from Alabama who are in the Nation of Islam. This is a question which pertains to what it says, describe the relationship of the Obama administration to Arab Spring. First, we heard there was a revolution supposedly coming from these Muslim Brotherhood circles. And then we heard there wasn't one when even larger demonstrations came out in the second process. So how did this work, and what role from your standpoint did the United States play? And specifically, they're asking about Obama.
Well, the Obama administration was totally in bed with not only the Muslim Brotherhood, but the controllers of the Muslim Brotherhood. You remember the Muslim Brotherhood was a creation of the British intelligence to encounter, in the name of pan-Islamism, to encounter the nationalist liberation movements against the British and French and other colonial powers before and after World War II. So they invented this Islamic identity to replace the nationalist identity in Egypt, in Iran, in Iraq, and so on and so forth. So this British creation, and Obama went along with it, but also Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, these are also actually creations of the British Empire, and their intelligence services worked closely in the whole Afghan war, and the United States was involved in that. But the idea with the Arab Spring was, yes, there was corruption in the regimes, there was economic degeneration, but that was actually a result of these regimes working with the IMF and the World Bank and the United States and Europe in the first place. That's where the disaster came from, which the people revolted against. But then this revolt was hijacked. And also because the people who did the revolt, they had no idea where they are going. They didn't have a solution. They didn't have a program how to replace this system with another system. That's what I'm working on in Iraq. I said, look, don't go out and demonstrate and to change the government. You have to have an idea first what you want to replace it with. So anyway, the British and the Obama administration and their allies went systematically into these movements in Tunis first, in Egypt, Libya, and then Syria. And Turkey, which is a Muslim Brotherhood government, was completely in the game. So the Obama administration was 100% into this game, but it was run by British intelligence. The United States' role was to provide weapons, money, and logistics, and so on. Like the CIA were standing on the border between Syria and Turkey and handing out weapons to the Islamic Mujahideen, but who will they give to? It's pointed to them by the British guy standing next to them, say, you give the weapons to these guys. These are our men. So the Obama administration, as Michael Flynn, the former security advisor, national security advisor, explained that actually the ISIS and all these movements were created by the process of regime change in these countries. But fortunately, like in Egypt, as I explained, there was a second wave, what our questioners are referring to, when the Muslim Brotherhood started, they won the election the next year in 2012, after 2011. They did not really participate in the beginning in the revolt, but they came at the end and took over because they were well financed and they were well organized. They have massive networks. But then after 1 year, and I wrote actually a forecast. I said, I looked at the economic program of the Muslim Brotherhood president, Mohammed Mahmoud Morsi. And in June 2012, it was called the 100-day program. And just looking at the economic program, I said, there will be new social unrest and revolts because what they are proposing is not going to solve any of the problems which the people in the first place revolted against. And there will be a new uprising and the army will intervene on the side of the people. And that happened exactly 1 year later. And of course, I based my analysis on LaRouche's way of forecasting things, because if you don't look at the physical reality, you cannot, there is a natural law, you cannot defy it. And that's what happened in June, July 2013. There was a new revolt, and the army intervened, and they took and cleaned the whole country out of the Muslim Brotherhood. And that's what saved Egypt. And now Egypt is a pivotal country for stability in the whole region. So yes, the Obama administration was hand in gloves with the British intelligence and the Muslim Brotherhood.
Okay. We have a second question from New York. This one says, watching Hussein's presentation makes it clear to me that the world is ready to progress beyond the petty grievances that hold humanity back. Countries that have been considered third world, quote unquote, for a long time have now revolted against the imposed circumstances that have originated from the British and the United States interventions. My question is, what redemption is there for the United States? The world could do just fine without us. So what role should we serve? Should the United States seek out help from other countries that are developing? So I think what we'll do, Harley, why don't we go to you first and then see if Diane has something and then back to Hussein.
Well, I think the obvious point is that the United States has to be saved. There is so much the United States could do to play a positive role working with Russia, with China, with a renewed series of national governments in Europe. There's so much that could be done based on our own past experience. If you go back to the Roosevelt period, what was done with the TVA, with the Grand Coulee Dam project, the Hoover Dam, the job training programs, and so on. Then again, with the Kennedy period, with the space, the initiatives around the space program, well, we're seeing that now being adopted by countries such as China, the United Arab Emirates. Much of the world is moving toward capturing this enthusiasm and optimism that comes from a space program. So we still have that kind of capability in the United States. The problem that we have is the combination of this pessimism, but also a banking system which is controlled by people who will do everything possible to destroy that optimism. And this is where the question of the importance of a cultural renaissance comes in. You know, this question that we had from LaRouche in his presentation before the Chestnut Commission that you showed at the beginning, Dennis, where he talked about this idea of the uniqueness of the human species, the idea of being created in the image and likeness of the living God as a creative being. Once you give that up, then you'll accept the worst elements of identity politics, which prevent us from doing anything in our own country or anywhere. But if you break with that, if you break out of this what is narrow nationalism? You know, the important question is, do we have a national mission? We were created as a nation with a national mission, and we've lost that. And instead, we're now trapped in this environment with increasingly smaller groups fighting for a piece of a shrinking pie. So I think the important thing for the United States is to recover our sense of our tradition, our real tradition, not the phony ideas of the exceptionalism, but the real idea of exceptionalism as pronounced by Hamilton, by John Quincy Adams, by Abraham Lincoln. This idea that we have a capability, a system that allows the individual to develop. And that's not against government or against other people, but that the individual development actually is improved to the extent that you have a government that functions on the basis of the fighting for the general welfare of the population. So if we do that, we can play a role with all these other countries. If not, we're going to play a role in destroying humanity, because that's what you get when you look at the hotspots that I started with, and you look at the insanity of saying that for humanitarian reasons, we're going to starve the people of Syria. To defend the integrity of Ukraine, we're going to start a nuclear war with Russia. These are insane statements, and people cannot tolerate that kind of thinking coming from our political leaders.
Diane?
Well, I think the United States can play an important role for the good. And I think one part of that would be that we have to exonerate LaRouche, and that Lyndon LaRouche's writings, particularly his breakthroughs in the science of physical economy, have to be made available to every single student in this country. It's really an outrage when you have someone who made as many unique and brilliant contributions to human knowledge as Lyndon LaRouche did, and this is like a secret from the population. That's number one. The other is, I think that, there's a quality of goodness in the American people, and I think part of the pessimism comes from not being able to act on that. If you think about the response you see from Americans, what people did on 9/11, what people did after Hurricane Katrina or Harvey or other catastrophes, if Americans could figure out how to do something about the situation in Puerto Rico or Haiti, I think people would want to do that. And the suppression of that impulse really causes a lot of damage. So I think we have to give people the opportunity to do the good, which will be very liberating for Americans. And I think we actually can contribute much more than we're aware of. But I concur also with what Harley said. If we don't do that, we will be, unfortunately, a force for a great deal of trouble and perhaps even the annihilation of the human race.
We're going to allow Hussein to answer this, but I want to actually interpolate something here right now because I think will help. As a matter of fact, it demonstrates how somebody does that. And this is a portion of the same Human Rights Commission hearings, but this one features the former Attorney General of the United States, Ramsey Clark. Some people know, or I think everyone should know, Mr. Clark passed away last Friday on April 9th, and he had been very important in the defense of Lyndon LaRouche. But we are going to show you here an excerpt, and I actually want to get responses from the whole panel on what they're about to see.
Ramsey Clark, who has been with me, former Attorney General of the United States, who has been with me on all of the appeals. He joined the effort just after the sentencing of Mr. LaRouche and his colleagues in 1990. Recently, he wrote a letter to the Attorney General asking for a departmental review of the LaRouche case, and I'd like to read you some portions of his letter. He'll be here tomorrow to speak to you personally, but I'd like to leave you with the following words of Ramsey Clark. Dear Attorney General Reno, I've been an attorney in this case since shortly after the defendants were sentenced in January 1990 and appeared as counsel on appeal and on the subsequent motions and appeals in proceedings under 28 U.S. Code Section 2255 and Federal Rules Criminal Procedure Rule 33. I bring this matter to you directly because I believe it involves a broader range of deliberate and systematic misconduct and abuse of power over a longer period of time in an effort to destroy a political movement and leader than any other federal prosecution in my time or to my knowledge. 3 courts have now condemned the department's conduct in this prosecutorial campaign. The result has been a tragic miscarriage of justice, which at this time can only be corrected by an objective review and courageous action by the Department of Justice.
And I'll start and end with the case of Lyndon LaRouche and his co-defendants. Not because it's the alpha and omega, although it's about as close as a case gets to the potential perfidy of justice, but because it shows how bad it can be, and yet it has, as so very, very few of these cases ever do, a positive side that we have to consider. I'd followed the earlier case in Boston, which by any measure was an extremely peculiar case, both in its charges in its prosecution and in its history. I knew the judge there as a fellow Texan. His brother, Page Keaton, had been dean of the law school where I started out down at the University of Texas. And he's one of the old school that doesn't like tricks, falsity, or injustice. And he became outraged with the prosecution. And did a lot. I can't tell you he did all that a judge could have done. I believe Odin will agree, though, he did a lot. There are not many judges who come through a political conditioning and process who have the courage to stand up to the power of the executive branch, to the FBI and others, and say the things that he did. And that's was almost an early end to a malicious prosecution. But in what was as complex and pervasive a utilization of law enforcement, prosecution, media, and non-governmental organizations focused on destroying an enemy. This case must be number one. There are some where the government itself may have done more and more wrongfully over a period of time. But the very networking and combination of federal, state, and local agencies, of executive and even some legislative and judicial branches, of major media and minor local media, and of influential lobbyist types, the ADL preeminently. This case takes the prize. The purpose can only be seen as destroying. It's more than a political movement. It's more than a political figure. It is those two. But it's a fertile engine of ideas. A common purpose of thinking and studying and analyzing to solve problems regardless of the impact on the status quo or on vested interests. It was a deliberate purpose to destroy that at any cost. In the LaRouche case, they're book people. I have to confess to the intellectual weakness. I find reading easier than thinking, so I read constantly, nearly blinded myself from too much reading. Got 15,000 books at home, read most of them, unfortunately. As you can tell, I haven't learned much, but I haven't stopped yet. These are book people. They had publishing houses going on. Important publications, nonprofit stuff. The government comes in and these are just some of the peripheral things that Odin and others might not have explained to you. But these are what they were about: ideas, information, social change, meeting the needs of human people all over the world, humanity all over the world. We're going to have 1 billion more people before the end of this millennium, century, decade, and the vast majority, 80% of them, are going to have beautiful, darker skin, and they're going to live short lives of sickness, hunger, pain, ignorance, and violence unless we act radically. And these books have ideas. Some will work, some won't work, but they're ideas. They can be tested in the marketplace, as we used to say. And they come in with a bankruptcy claim, a false bankruptcy claim against nonprofit publishing houses and shut them down. What's the First Amendment worth, you know?
We've used the term American exceptionalism a lot today, but this is an example of what it really means. Ramsey Clark was an exceptional American. He had courage, he had convictions, and he stood by them when they were extremely unpopular. So, Hussein, let me go to you first in terms of both the question that you heard and, I think you remember it, and just what you may think about what you've just seen and heard.
Yeah, it's fantastic to hear Ramsey Clark speak. I have heard these times and times again for many years. I've been with the LaRouche organization for almost 30 years now. And every time I'm really shocked that you had that kind of intellectual capabilities in the United States. I've seen them more. I mean, Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, of course, is a giant, but you have an enormous intellectual arsenal in the United States, going all the way back to the founding fathers, and the great, James Fenimore Cooper, Washington Irving, Edgar Poe. These are giants, and you have, even in the intelligence community in your country, such intellectuals. I mean, Ray McGovern is a person I have deep respect for because of his, culture. He's a cultivated person. He's not an intelligent official. But the thing is, and that's what is wonderful about the United States, because you have that inside, but it is covered with layers and layers of pessimism and ideology, which is completely crazy. I mean, this is this Hobbesian view of the world, that you are in a jungle somehow, and if you don't have a big stick, the others will eat your lunch, as President Biden said about the Chinese. What do you mean they eat your lunch? They're not out there to eat your lunch. They are helping you produce medicines. Last year, in the middle of the disaster of the pandemic, while the US president was saying horrible things about China, China increased its exports to the United States. Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he came to Congress in March last year, and they asked him, how much are we dependent on the US, on the China for our medicines? And he said, well, when it comes to the US armed forces, I guess it's between 89 and 97% of all our medicines, antibiotics, and vaccines we use in the US Army come from China. So, imagine this incredible irony. So when it comes to what the Americans can do, I mean, I don't like to tell other people what to do in their country. And I don't like other people to tell me what to do in my country. And most people around the world, they don't like Americans to tell them how they should think and what they should do. And this is something Americans don't understand. Keep your advice for yourself. What happens in China, what happens in Iran, what happens, it's none of your business. But if you see something you can contribute, you should approach those nations and contribute something positive. Now, the United States is in a deep crisis, as we know. You have social injustice, you have racism, you have the nation is infrastructure is collapsing, the healthcare is collapsing. And you have somebody offering you something positive. You should take it, and that's the Belt and Road Initiative. China did not say we are creating a private exclusive club, just me and my friends. We call it the new Silk Road Belt and Road Initiative, and we're going to build infrastructure, healthcare, water systems, power plants, just for our closest friends. That didn't happen. Now there are 140 nations have joined that, and their arms are stretched to the United States, to contribute, because China alone cannot do the massive work needed to develop the world and get rid of all the poverty and disease that is there. Look at Africa. I mean, Africa is 3 times larger than China, and there are 54 nations. The population is as big as China, but it's going to be double that soon. So China alone cannot do these things. So the United States and Europe are called upon now, for their own sake, but also for the sake of humanity, to contribute something positive to reverse the horrible things that were committed in the name of the American people in the last 50 years of history. So you have a chance, grab it. You know, you have a free ride now with China, and even Russia want you to join. You can get a free ride on the Belt and Road and start building your own infrastructure, start contributing to the development of other nations. The United States still has a certain technological and industrial base that's very, very important for the rest of the world. That's what the United States can contribute. No ideologies, no exceptionalism, no this and that. Just work together, hard work, disciplined work, and good work.
Okay, Diane or Harley? Diane, I look like you're about to talk. Go ahead.
I appreciate what Hussein is saying. I don't really have much to add. I think what Ramsey Clark just said is tremendous. I had heard it before, but I'm hearing it differently now. And I actually think we should make a short excerpt of that and get it out far and wide.
And Harley?
Well, what you see in Ramsey Clark, which is exceptional, is a passion for development, a passion for mankind's development. And this is expressed in a way that you saw over and over with Lyndon LaRouche. It starts from a love of fellow man, not a touchy-feely kind of thing, but an expression of a sense that we have a higher purpose. And this higher purpose has to be infused in our nation. We have a national mission that reflects a higher purpose, not we're number one, but that we intend to do the good, the way Hussein was just discussing. And this requires also a personal mission for what the Greeks called the development of character. And I think you saw that statement from Ramsey Clark. I agree with Diane. That's something we should get out, because it does fit a certain quality of the World War II generation that did give so much. And we have a responsibility, those of my generation and the younger generations, to fulfill that mission. And that mission never stops. So I was very much moved by that passion that you see with them. And that's what you see with the call from Helga Zepp-LaRouche for crying out for justice for the children of Syria. And I think that's what we should take from this meeting.
There are a couple of questions for you, Harley. One from our friends in Costa Rica who are saying, I'm watching, but I'm way behind. But if possible, can you please ask Harley to explain what role Vice President Biden played in the Ukraine geopolitical circumstance during the Obama administration? Now, you referenced once more on what you referenced there. This one references something like it. This is from New York, and it just says the current economic warfare against Russia in the form of sanctions is scheduled to begin sometime in June 14th, I think is the actual date. It's structured in such a way that extends beyond the United States dealing with Russia and includes punishing nations wanting to engage Russia in all forms of physical, financial, and economic relations. And this mirrors something like the Ukrainian NATO membership. Can you outline some of the particulars of the economic trap and the kinds of problems that the Anglo-Dutch are likely to run into if they try to implement it? This was also directed to you, Harley.
Well, let's start with Biden in Ukraine. He was the point man for the Obama policy, which meant that, according to several people who were working with him, he was on the phone at least once a week with either the president or the prime minister of Ukraine after the coup in 2014. Now, leading up to the coup, Biden was very much involved in pulling together the networks that were involved in the coup. Now, who were some of these networks? I don't know if I made this clear in the earlier presentation, but one of the people who was involved in Ukraine was none other than Christopher Steele, the famous former MI6 operative who played such a big role in shaping the Russiagate narrative. Christopher Steele was writing memos that were delivered through Jonathan Weiner, who was an official in the State Department, to John Kerry, who was at the time Secretary of State. And these were discussed by Victoria Nuland and by Biden. So they were on the ground reports of what was happening in Ukraine. This is where Biden was involved in the famous statement he gave to the Council of Foreign Relations in, I believe it was 2018, where he described what he did to force the firing of the prosecutor who was looking into the corruption of Burisma, the oil company. And he bragged about how he told the president of Ukraine, if you don't fire this guy, you won't get $1 billion in weapons shipments. And he said, and by God, he was fired. So Biden played a personal role in shaping the policy. Now, how much did he know? Did he know what the Azov battalion was? Did he know what these guys were? He couldn't help but knowing, because anyone who was involved in that knows that the way regime change works is you take legitimate grievances. And what was the legitimate grievance in Ukraine? Well, the economy was stuck. You had an International Monetary Fund policy, which was not allowing the country to develop. And so you had the same thing with the Arab Spring, the same thing with virtually every country in the developing sector. So you take people who are dissatisfied, put them in the streets, but then you need more than that to get a regime change. You need outside help. Victoria Nuland said $5 billion was spent to bring about the coup in Ukraine. You don't think Biden knew about that? You don't think he knew about Soros's role? So clearly, his involvement in this was to ensure that this would be used against Russia. Because the whole point in Ukraine was to move NATO further to the east and threaten Russia. And Biden wrote several articles, including one that came out in 2014, How to Stand Up to Russia. And one of the points he makes at the end of that article, and this is, by the way, in Foreign Affairs magazine, the magazine of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the primary think tank for British American policymaking. What he said is that a forward deployment of NATO is essential to blunt the Russian aggression toward Europe. So that he wrote in an article in 2014. So of course he knew what he was doing there. Now, how much does he know today? Look, you know, the one thing you can say is if he and Putin do get together, there may be a shock to Biden to find that Putin does have a soul and that Putin does have a strategy. And perhaps there'll be some possibility of changing between now and then. But, you know, just to give you a sense of what's going on in Ukraine, the ambassador of Ukraine to Germany basically said, if we don't get to join NATO, we may have to develop nuclear weapons. Now, that's the kind of threat which could provoke World War III. Now, the second question on economic sanctions against Russia, what they're essentially saying is that they're going to stop anyone from purchasing Russian-denominated debt, that is bond offerings, government bonds, that anybody who purchases government bonds or is involved in any way in financing the Russian economy will be subjected to sanctions. This is to cut off any investment into Russia from outside of Russia. Now, if you do that at a point where Russia is fighting like hell to develop its economy, to have some improvements, and there are improvements in agriculture and certain other areas, but it's a real fight. And if you restrict credit, and it's similar to what they would, the threats that they'll kick Russia out of the SWIFT system so that you can't exchange currencies and basically makes it impossible for Russia to do any trade. This is designed to trigger a collapse of the financing of the Russian government, to collapse the Russian ruble, just as they've already collapsed the Syrian economy, the Syrian pound. So this is where you see sanctions as a form of real warfare. You know, the idea that sanctions will stop a war, what difference does it make if you kill someone with a drone attack or a bullet, or you take food and medicine out of the system? You're still killing people. This is warfare. And the idea that these kinds of threats, as Biden said, these are proportional, and we hope Russia responds in a proportional way. Well, the only proportional thing to do is to stop this, to have the dialogue, to have the discussion, to throw out the people who believe that conflict is necessary, that geopolitics is the way to run an international system. Because geopolitics essentially starts from the idea that you can't unite around common purposes, that you have to find the points of conflict and use that as a way of controlling and increasing the power of the unilateral forces. That's what the rules-based order is. So unless we give up this idea that we are the arbiters of the rules-based order, we are the unilateral power. This goes back to the project for the new American century, the neocons who brought us into all these endless wars. If Biden's serious about getting us out of Afghanistan and disengaging in the Middle East, a sanctions policy is not a way to do that, but honest, serious negotiation, diplomacy, common purpose. And as Hussein was saying, one of the best ways of doing that is to work together to develop Africa, to develop Southeast and Southwest Asia, to engage in reconstruction there. That's the way that you solve these things. Certainly not by imposing sanctions that will destroy an economy.
Okay. We have coming sort of to the conclusion, but there's something for you, Diane. Here's a question. Well, it says, last night you had a program entitled The Untapped Potential of America's Invisible Class. Can you say something about who you mean and what that untapped potential is?
Sure. As I have been looking at the situation in New York City in particular, starting from the time of that I founded the Schiller Institute NYC Chorus, it became apparent. I mean, one, you have the disintegration, but also in 2018, the New York Times had done an article on the fact that there are 114,000 children in the New York City public school system who are homeless. I don't know what it is now with the COVID situation. Everything is different. I also am aware that the shelters in New York City for families reject about 70% of the applicants who don't meet whatever the requirements are. And I find it hard to believe, knowing the conditions of some of these shelters and the substandard housing they put people in, that people would lie and claim that they're homeless when they're not actually. And then you find out about what's happening in the prisons, the situation with the deinstitutionalization of people who were mentally ill that went on in the 70s. And what's very clear is you have a huge number of people in the millions, perhaps tens of millions, who are essentially just written off. You have 2 million people in the United States who are in prison, perhaps as high as 7 million who are somehow involved in the parole and, related to prison process. And I'm not really sure how many people are experiencing homelessness right now in the country, because that's very hard to measure. But I would say it's probably over 1 million or 1.5 million, that kind of thing. Now, what I mean is that we have been thinking much too small. I was really delighted to see what Hussein presented about Egypt and the new capital that they are constructing. They're planning a city for 7 million people. That's phenomenal. We have a huge part of the United States out in the Midwest area that has virtually no one living in it. I'm not aware of when the last time was that we built a new city, let alone a science city or a cultural city or a city, from scratch with a specific mission, or just to lift a lot of people out of poverty in this country. I think it's a very exciting idea. Or to rebuild an old city, as is urgently needed in New York, Chicago, many places. Now, the question is, if we decided to actually do something on the scale that's required, where are you going to get the workforce? I think years ago, who knows what it is now, the average age of a machinist was something like 67. The machinists I know all tell me they're irreplaceable. They have no one coming up through their machine shop who's competent to replace what they're doing. So how are we going to address this? We better start planning now while a bunch of these people are still alive, and also, frankly, before the total breakdown. One of my guests last night ran a training program for cement and concrete workers, and he actually worked with many people who were on parole, who had recently come out of prison. Many of them turned into highly skilled laborers. So I think we have to consider, if we're going to do what is needed, there is a great potential in the population that is largely overlooked and not counted. And one other thing I'll say may upset some people, but was brought up by this labor union fellow the other night, is the illegal immigrants. He said these corporations imply a huge number. In fact, most of the jobs he's involved in have some labor employees, but also a huge number of people here who are here illegally, and therefore you don't have to pay taxes on them. They don't pay taxes. They don't have benefits. It saves Wall Street and these giant corporations a lot of money, but it lowers the standard for our whole workforce. So that has to be addressed. These people should be paid a decent wage. They should become citizens, pay taxes, make a contribution to society, be part of society. And it is a typical British game people have heard, divide and conquer, where you pit skilled labor union workers against illegal immigrants or people who are not unionized, and demand that people all sink to the lowest standard, or that people get embroiled in conflict against each other, when actually we're all up against the same enemy. So I hope that gives some idea, but I just think it depends on how you look at it. If we were interested in actually solving these problems, then some of the things that we consider part of the problem, we would discover to actually be our greatest resource.
We have a short video from Lyndon LaRouche again at that Human Rights Commission's hearing, where he's referring to his own experience in jail, and specifically what he saw among the African American section of the prisoners in jail.
I saw African Americans in prison. I saw what's done to them. I worked with them. I know what was going on. It's destruction, pure destruction. When these people get out of prison, it's a wonder that any of them has any capacity to survive. Everything is taken away from them. They're being destroyed. 2 years in prison, they've lost their wife. They've lost their family. 15 years from now, the children will probably be in some criminal trouble. The wife may get into criminal trouble. The whole community is tainted. Whole communities in this country are tainted by this process, which the brother referred to. But the problem today, what makes the American races today, is not race hatred as such. It's something deeper and more original. It's me. Concern for themselves and willing to throw the other guy in the lifeboat overboard to survive. And they just want an excuse to make it easy to pick out who goes overboard. It's in moral indifference. And there's no cure for this except the one the New Testament provides. Agape, love. If you can inspire people to begin to care and to hope, you can get them to shirk this indifference. And the worst racism, in my experience, is not the guy who was raised with a red neck and a wool hat. The worst racist, remember the Ku Klux Klan, when it recruited under Woodrow Wilson, who was one of the leaders of the recruiting of the Klan. It was recruited largely in places like Wisconsin, Minnesota, Indiana, Ohio, and so forth, Illinois. So it wasn't rednecks. What was created was indifference was turned into scapegoating of your fellow man. Find somebody to club, find somebody to hate, find a prisoner to execute, find an immigrant to throw out of the country, find a scapegoat. And then some clever swine comes along and says, why don't you pick him for a scapegoat? And out of pure middle-class piggish indifference, you've turned a liberal into a racist. And that's our problem.
Okay, so we're at the point of conclusion, pretty much. There are a couple of other questions, but I think we're going to forego them because of time considerations. And so let's do the following. Diane, I'm going to ask you to go. Actually, yes, well, you just spoke. So how about we go to Harley first, see what he's got to say for conclusion.
Well, I think if people take seriously what we've been presenting, the idea that there are very serious problems is clear, but there are also solutions. And the solutions are not just policy questions, but I think, again, we just saw from Lynn something that was very powerful, this idea that each of us has to find in ourselves the capacity to love our fellow man. That doesn't mean you embrace all the problems. Doesn't mean you give up the idea of perfectibility and just accept people as they are. To love someone means that you challenge them to live up to their standards. And I think this is what we have to do. For example, what we started with today is ending the Caesar sanctions, ending a policy which says that we're going to force a nation to get rid of its leader because we're going to starve them until they do, which is what this policy represents. We armed and trained a radical force of Islamic terrorists with ISIS and Al-Qaeda to try and overthrow the government of Syria. And the people of Syria proved resilient. There was help for them from Russia, and even a little bit of help from the United States toward the end. But the people of Syria have a right to make that choice. And the idea that somehow we're going to be the good uncle and beat the hell out of them until they submit, that's not the traditions of our country. We're better than that. And I think that's where this question of the empathy for our fellow man becomes the basis for what our policy should be. So I think if people take that seriously, we can accomplish what we have to end these sanctions.
Okay, thank you. Hussein?
Yes, well, first of all, I think people have to take very, very seriously what Helga Tsep-LaRouche's warnings about in what a dire situation we are now, a very, very dangerous situation. And also the wonderful things that Mr. LaRouche was saying today. Now, there's something, it's very difficult to explain it, but I give classes in economics, LaRouche economics, regularly to now more and more Iraqi young people are coming around us. And many of those young people are quite skinny, actually, because they were born in the late 1990s when Iraq was under very, very harsh economic sanctions and blockade by both the United States, but also the UN. I mean, you remember Madeleine Albright once bragged that 500,000 Iraqi children dead was a fair price to contain Saddam Hussein. Those guys I'm talking to now, and they are studying Lyndon LaRouche's ideas. They were born in these days, but they look up to Lyndon LaRouche, an American, but let me just tell you, LaRouche is not a typical American. Anybody who has known him, no, he's not a typical American, but he comes out of the American, the best of the American tradition. And those young people say, so this whole Silk Road started from this American guy? It's the brainchild of an American? And yes, it is. That's what Ramsey Clark was referring to. These people produce ideas and they throw it out and they organize around it. And we don't know if they will become real or not. And Guess what? A lot of it is becoming real now. But the problem is that the US policy today, with all these sanctions and war, it's impeding the spread of life in the biosphere, so to speak, in Vernadsky's terms, Vladimir Vernadsky's terms. So I think the American people and their leadership, they should honor their son, Lyndon LaRouche, because they did great injustice to him. But by doing that, they will help people understand his ideas and the ideas of his associates and what the LaRouche organization is fighting for. And I think that would be a great step for the American people and their elites to be able to play a more positive role in the world.
Thank you. Diane?
Well, I would just say there's something from President Kennedy, which people only tend to quote in part, and I don't have the exact wording, but where he says, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, and what your country can do for mankind. And I think that that is the way every American should be thinking. Our revolution against the British Empire was meant to be a turning point for civilization. Our Declaration of Independence is a universal document. It does not mean only the people within the borders of what is known as the United States of America. And I think that if we can, as Americans, once again embody that conception, that people will be very happy to collaborate with us, as opposed to what we see right now. And I am actually optimistic because I think that, in a way, as long as we don't get annihilated in a nuclear war, which is a very real threat, the crisis is our friend. And it seems to be a very fine line in human history where the potential for complete annihilation begins and people wake up and change their behavior. But we're somewhere in there right now. And we, of course, intend to fight for the latter option.
So Hussein Askary, Harley Schlanger, Diane, Sare, I want to thank you for being here to deliver all of this, and also welcome you to say a lot more the next time you show up. What we're going to do today, of course, we do want people to respond to the idea of getting in touch with us. There will be a conference, by the way, in 3 weeks on May 8th of the Schiller Institute, which will be the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites. And it was being called in a response to the call both by Cardinal Zanari of Syria for action against the Caesar sanctions, but more importantly, in one sense, the idea of taking the occasion of these horsemen, famine, disease, and war, and the idea of the need for a new committee of for the coincidence of opposites that comes together and brings us to a higher moral, intellectual, and spiritual ground from which we can actually address these matters. We're going to close today in a somewhat unusual way. What we're going to do is to play for you a section of a speech by Ramsey Clark given in 2015 at an event that was sponsored by the Schiller Institute at the Riverside Church in New York City. It was at the time of the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. Mr. Clark was specifically referring to the fact that King had given a speech in that very same church on April 4th, 1967, opposing the Vietnam War. And this was traumatic for King. It was something that was a complete departure from his earlier career, if you will, as a civil rights leader. And now he was saying something about his nation and about the issue of war. But there's an extensive excerpt that we're going to leave you with. Before we do that, there's a statement that has been just written by Helga Sepp-LaRouche in honor of Ramsey Clark, in memoriam. A representative of the American ideal. My late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, and Ramsey Clark had both a boundless respect for each other, recognizing in each other that specific quality of character that is incapable of committing a falseness or making any kind of compromise with the truth for personal benefit. Both of them had the characteristics that belonged to the World War II generation, the better part of which shared the moral outlook of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that it was the moral obligation of the United States to help the developing countries to overcome the relics of colonial underdevelopment. The better people of that generation had a value set which was truly Republican in the sense of the American Revolution, and was not tainted by any of the several paradigm changes of the post-war generations. That's an excerpt from the statement, the full text of which will be available shortly at the Schiller Institute site. And so we want to thank all of you for joining us today for today's meeting. And we will now play you our tribute in memoriam to Ramsey Clark. Our next speaker was in charge as Deputy Attorney General of the security in 1965, 50 years ago, for the Selma to Montgomery March, the third march, which actually got to Montgomery. And I understand that he also got a call from Dr. Martin Luther King after he gave his speech here in 1967, because Dr. King was very concerned that the press would try to distort what he had to say. And he wanted to make sure that he at least had one reliable legal representative that would not misrepresent what his intent was and his intent that day was. Besides those particular distinctions, he's always stood for justice. Matter of fact, he stood for justice in the case of Lyndon LaRouche, as many of you here know. And he stood for justice over and over all over the world. It's always an honor to have him speak. And he can only be here for a few minutes with us today. So I'd like, and it's always my honor, to introduce former Attorney General of the United States, Ramsey Clark.
In his speech in this church in 1967, I guess it was, I'll correct myself if I search and find otherwise, Dr. King said some words that hurt him deeply and personally, but he felt had to be said. And they were these: the greatest purveyor of violence on earth is my own country. It hurt him palpably to say it, but it was a truth he felt deeply, and he said it. The next day, a couple of lawyer friends of his showed up, and they had a copy of the speech. And they said, Dr. King wanted to be sure I had a accurate copy of what he really said. And it was that the greatest purveyor of violence on earth is my own country. Conditions haven't changed globally in that particular, I'm afraid. We remain the greatest purveyor of violence on earth. We glorify its power and ignore its pity. Just look at our entertainment, our war films and our crime films. And it's like we've got a love affair with violence. And yet the words he spoke here will win the struggle if human life is to endure on this planet. And I'm an optimist. I'm sure it will, at least from our own hand, which is the cruelest fate of all. The first night out, I was sent down to Montgomery, Alabama, about 4 days before the march started. I was Deputy Attorney General at the time, which is on the organization chart, the second highest ranking officer in the department. Requires presidential nomination and Senate confirmation. And my assignment was to protect the order of a U.S. federal judge who had prescribed the fashion in which people could march from Selma to Montgomery along a public highway. And it was litigated for quite a while and came up with the solution that 50 people could be chosen and march two abreast. If you see the movie Selma, which I recommend, but the movie Selma is about Selma, and it's about the courage and beauty of the people there who were tired of a sheriff who liked to walk his horses over their bodies. A man named Clark, no relation that I'm aware of, or if there is, I'd just claim it now. Not that, had I been in his shoes, I might have been the same. But the march was an interesting occasion in studying the character, the moral character of our society. The FBI, which always requires someone who wants to know the truth to be carefully observed in its statements, told me that there were 1,200 men who had served lengthy convictions in prison for white racist crime against African Americans who had come to the Selma Montgomery area, 1,200. They're out of prison now, and they had rifles on the rack in the back of the cabin of their pickup trucks. And the Bureau, whose assumptions I don't usually follow, was that they intended to use those rifles if they got a chance. We brought a diversity of law enforcement into that area that was certainly unprecedented in this country in terms of its diversity, in terms of its magnitude. In terms, we had 10,000 standing by in reserve. It'd taken maybe 48 hours to get into action. But we had Border Patrol and U.S. Marshals, and to the extent that we could rely on them, some state and local agents and Army standing by for 50 people to do under a court order, which was litigated for about a year and a half before you could undertake the project in a free society, to do something that no one in his right mind would want to do unless someone dared them to, and that was walk from Selma to Montgomery. I remember John Doerr got so sunburned I thought he was going to lose his nose. Even though it was in March, the sun was really hot down there. Top of my ears got blistered, and my nose is bigger than his, and it got more blistered than his, but I couldn't see it as well as I could see his. And the fear was palpable. The first night we got across the bridge, I nearly lost my job because I was standing on the far side of the Raymond Pettis Bridge by a Border Patrol car. I always like Border Patrolmen because they're kind of cowboys, and they work independently, and they don't have a director of the FBI who's making them dress like they're on Wall Street or someplace, and go in pairs because they're afraid. I was standing by this Border Patrol car with an open mic to about 6 other Border Patrol cars that were stationed all around so we could talk to each other immediately. And they started across the bridge, and I made the unfortunate error of saying, "Here they come, isn't it beautiful?" Monday morning, this was Sunday, Monday morning, the New York Times headline is, "Deputy Attorney General down there to be neutral," and protect the marchers from the public and the public from the marchers. At the point at which the marchers started over the bridge, said, "Look at that, isn't it beautiful?" For which some of my superiors were uncomplimentary about my verbiage. But it was beautiful. The idea that it would take a force of that magnitude to, and it wouldn't really, but it would take a pretty good force to make it safe. To do something that no one in his right mind would want to do anyway, and that is march from Selma to Montgomery, even though it's March, in the month of March as well as a Marching month, broiling sun. And the first night we got out to, I'd talked to the farmer myself. We'd leased some land. We paid him some money so we could stay on his land, because we didn't want to have, some conflict about, hey, get off my property. There weren't other places that were as convenient. And I forgot what I paid him, but maybe $500 or something for 50 people to spend the night on his land on the ground, or most of them had sleeping bags, something like that. We got there and he said, "Can't do it. You can't come on my land. I've been threatened, and it's getting to be dark." But I've been up and down that road so many times I knew every foot of it, and there was a state park. It wasn't a mile and a half or 2 miles further down the road, so we just went on down there. And I set up sentries to march around the campers. We set up some 4-foot sidewall army tents and had sleeping bags for the 50. And so about 11 o'clock, Dr. King grabbed me and we walked away from the crowd. We were sitting around fires, and we had these sentries. It looked like a Civil War scene to me. And he said, "I think you've been told I've got to fly to Chicago in the morning." I said, "No, I haven't been told." He said, "Yeah, I'm going to leave here about 3 in the morning, so I'm going to sleep now." I kind of fussed at him. "So you got to tell me when you're going to do those things, because I want to be sure you're safe, man. You can't be driving yourself or having somebody drive you down that road by yourself without protection." But we were by this tent. We were looking down. It looked like a Civil War scene here in the United States of America in 1965, with campfires and sentries marching around the 50 people. And there's only one of the 50 that slept any that night, as far as I could tell, and that was I didn't. I wasn't one of the 50, but I was supposed to be in charge of their safety, which was kind of ridiculous in itself. I'd been a Marine corporal and a life scout, Boy Scout, but I wasn't a professional in the field of protection. He got up and left and got back Monday night, but the other marchers didn't really sleep that night. They sat around the campfire and they talked and thought, and some of them came up and got in the tents for a while. and we marched on. Hard to believe that the palpable fear of violence and the actuality of risk. I have no idea whether there are really 1,200 men with felony convictions for racist violence, all white, all the men that were there with their guns on racks behind them, most of them in pickups. Were there and had the will to shoot, but I was flying a plane back that Friday after we'd gotten to Montgomery, and all the speechifying had gone on in front of the Capitol. And it was a little Army plane, about a 12-passenger plane, but they had a door between. The pilot came back and said, got a phone message for you. So I went up in the cockpit and listened. They said that a woman had been killed on the way back to Selma. She was taking some of the people who'd come over for the march from Selma, that lived in Selma, wanted to go home, back, and was shot and killed. So we turned the plane around, flew back to Montgomery, and tried to see what we could do to show our sorrow and prevent further violence under pretty tense situation still. There were about 25,000 people that came from outside of Alabama to participate or just to stand there and watch. There was a big crowd out in front of the Capitol. Watch the speeches and all after the end of the march. You wonder how much it's really changed. You hope for the best, but you go to our prisons and you see they're overwhelmingly, disproportionately African American males, young, very young. Lives of freedom for them terminated, at least temporarily, of the length of their prison sentence, and probably at least freedom of will and mind and spirit badly damaged for the rest of their lives. Because we haven't found the capacity to love each other yet, and particularly when we have different colors of skin, which in my view doesn't tell you anything about what's underneath, except another human spirit. And we know of so many who were so great. Dr. King's spirit will prevail for societies, not just ours, in the spirits of many, many people for as long as our form of communication endures.